Good morning, good afternoon if you're joining us from Europe, and a good evening to people from joining us in Asia. Welcome to the third edition of the Indo-Pacific Security Dialogue. These are our monthly discussions, with experts such as think tankers, academics, journalists, and people who worked in government and now in the private sector. And what we're discussing is all things Indo-Pacific. And what a week we witnessed last week, with the U.S. presidential elections. Pollsters and pundits made their prognostications, ballots were cast, and then the Electoral College did its bit. President Trump won both the popular vote and the Electoral College. The first time for a GOP candidate winning the popular vote, since 2004. We're going back to Bush 43 year. President Trump's resounding victory means the return to the White House, making him both the 45th and the 47th president. Feat previously only achieved by Grover Cleveland, who was the 22nd and the 24th president. But now, what we've seen right now from the first Trump administration is President Trump prioritized the Indo-Pacific as a preeminent focus of Washington's foreign policy, with the goal of securing a free and open Indo-Pacific. And since then, Washington and New Delhi have continued to deepen that partnership across various domains, from critical emerging technology to clean energy to rebuilding supply chains, fortifying defense, and cementing people-to-people ties. So, to unpack what a Trump 2.0 administration means for the region, I'm delighted to be joined by a panel of experts for this post-election debrief. Our panel today comprises of three phenomenal voices, who know all things Indo-Pacific, and we'll touch on, President Trump's, what we can think about 2025 and his plans for the region. So, very briefly, they don't need much of an introduction, but formality means I will have to introduce them. We have Professor C. Raja Mohan. He is currently a non-resident distinguished fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Vivek Mishra, Deputy Director, Strategic Program at ORF, and a visiting fellow at ORF America, and Garima Mohan, Senior Fellow, Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund. I'm Akshop Girdas here from USISPF, and just a few housekeeping rules. These conversations are being recorded and will be available later on USISPF's platform, so you can always view that. And I'm going to get started with a few questions. Starting with you, Professor Mohan. You're right now in Singapore. It's a city that you've lived in and know very well. I remember fondly from my time in Singapore in the newsroom. There was a sense of dismay back in 2016 when President Trump first won. Singapore is a place that kind of works by the rule book and follows certain rules. And President Trump is far from that. He's kind of a maverick. He's capricious, doesn't exactly follow the cookie cutter past president's playbook. So is the region better prepared for a Trump 2.0, or is uncertainty still the norm with President Trump?
No, I can't say they're better prepared. I mean, the fact that Trump won the Republican nomination so easily, and it was a two-horse race, so it was a question of last 6 months. So I think the problem in the region, as elsewhere around the world, I don't think there's enough understanding of the domestic forces that have propelled Trump to this sweeping victory. So I think the problem in most of the regions are looking at it bilaterally, rather than seeing the changing approach to key global issues within the United States, within the Republican Party, and the worldview of Trump, which will have a big effect on the rest of the world. So whatever we assess for bilateral or regional implications should be rooted in understanding the changing worldview of the Republican Party and the agenda that Trump has unveiled. For example, Southeast Asia is so deeply tied to the idea of globalization that it's going to take a long time to figure out what Trump means, though given as a hint last time. It is still not fully understood why the US is taking the kind of position. Second, the region has also benefited from US-China collaboration, cooperation. So for them, the question of dealing with the US-China confrontation remains a big challenge.
Thank you again, Professor Mohan, for that. I mean, it's obviously the elephant in the room was always the dragon. And, Garima, I want to get to you next. You're in Brussels, seat of EU power. US-EU relations and transatlantic relations have sort of been the dominant discourse since World War II. But, we've seen there's sort of a conscientious shift from, from transatlantic relations to Indo-Pacific and the littoral states right now. But President Trump, while he has been very acerbic in his past comments on NATO and didn't really in his first term engage much with transatlantic the same way, but Indo-Pacific was a priority for him. So can we expect more of the same? Little pushback from the EU side, a little more engagement on the Indo-Pacific side.
Let me focus first on U.S.-Europe ties. I mean, Europe was definitely taken aback by Trump's first term and his election, and certainly that is the feeling over here this time as well. Within 24 hours, the German government collapsed. I mean, not for related reasons, but adding to the turmoil on the continent. With Mr. Trump thinking that allies are burdens and the US should not bear the cost of European security, I mean, these views are not new, but I'm not sure that Europe has prepared in the meantime for a second Trump election. And his idea of, he can end the war in Ukraine with one day, and the relationship between Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin obviously is of concern to the Europeans. However, I think even in Trump's first term, there was an attempt to connect the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. Trump administration people and advisors often were in the European capitals to also talk, for example, of the 5G network security, keeping Huawei out of the system. But also we must remember the US-Europe dialogue on China was started under the Trump administration. In fact, the end of the Trump administration that Biden then continued so successfully. I think it really depends on the team that he selects and the tension between Mr. Trump's views and the team's views. For example, if Marco Rubio does become the Secretary of State, he has a very nuanced view on Europe, as well as being quite pro-Ukraine. So it would be interesting to see the team and how the tensions between the two play out.
Thank you for that. And especially right now, as you mentioned, Marco Rubio, there's a lot of movement right now on the cabinet picks and pending Senate confirmation, which should normally be fait accompli given the Republicans have the Senate. Vivek, I want to get to you. Right now, you're in Washington, D.C., and every election cycle, as we've seen, the Indian media will kind of has as normal when you have a two-horse race in the presidential system, it's natural to have questions and speculate on will a President Harris be better, will a President Trump be better? But what we've kind of seen since the reset of Clinton 2 in the 1990s, the estrangement to engagement period, is every US president has engaged effectively with India and left the relationship much better, from Clinton 2, after the sanctions. And, we had the civil nuclear deal under President Bush. You had President Obama, who designated India as a major defense partner, President Trump with Indo-Pacific. And of course, what you can absolutely see right now is with President Biden, who engaged in the Quad Leaders Summit. So is it fair to say that, irrespective of who comes, we've reached a level of political agnosticism just because of where India is, the importance of the region, and of course the China factor?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in saying that, it's been a successive work as governments on both sides to taking the relationship to where it is now. And there is a certain degree of continuity. And if you talk to most people on the Hill, there's about 90% that they say is on autopilot on India-US relationship. And therefore, the concerns there aren't much. It's the 10% that I think the Trump administration could bring in, and then the ripple effects, how it affects the other machinery of the India-US relationship, particularly in trade and the spin-offs. But I think if you also look at the long bet of the United States on India, it has to not just do with one-sided view from Washington, but also the position that India is on. And its economic status, the market status, also the fact that the geography of the Indo-Pacific is really volatile in the sense that you have Pakistan, which is out of the lens for the United States, and you have China on the other side, which is a competitor. And in between is placed India, which looks like a stable, solid anchor in the Indo-Pacific. And therefore, Washington has a clearer view of what it wants to do with India. And I think that's going to further solidify with the people, I think, that we're hearing within the Trump administration.
Professor Mohan, of course, there's a lot of talk right now with the, obviously we saw the successful Quad Summit in September, and India will host that in 2025. Just on the Quad joint statement, we've seen the fora committed to rejigging and rebuilding supply chains. Just on the US-India front itself, There's a lot more focus right now on semiconductor manufacturing, which will give India's manufacturing a boost. We've seen under the Biden administration, you had ISET and Indus. It ties into a lot of friendshoring and nearshoring and growth in all these various domains of AI, quantum, and cyber. But given that President Trump has sort of been seen as protectionist in the past and about bringing a lot of manufacturing back to the United States, do you see the new administration building on the previous administration's defense relationship with India, particularly because it's moved now from the archaic buy-sell model to one based on co-production and transfer of technology?
Look, I think there's been some continuity between Trump and Biden, so one would expect continuity will persist. Whatever the differences they have on a range of issues, on the question of international trade, on the question of US needs to restore manufacturing jobs at home, that what was started by Trump has been maintained by Biden. And in fact, Biden has been far more systematic in developing that national manufacturing policy, reshoring to the United States, as well as friendshoring to the partners. So I don't see a big change in the way this structure might continue. The one difference between Biden and Trump, I would say, Biden has been soft on the question of trade access to India, while Trump is going to be much harder. I mean, that he would want a clear, unambiguous commitments from India to give market access to the US. So that was the difference, but both were moved away from free trade. Both the presidents, both are critical of globalization. Both want to de-risk from China and work with the allies. The question is the terms is what is the issue, and I think Delhi should be prepared for a hard bargaining. And those of you, if you've seen Lighthizer book, he's very, very critical of India. Trump himself sees India as a major problem on the trade issue. So hopefully Delhi is gearing up to give and take. I mean, I think Delhi has had it good for a long time on economic issues, but now I think it has to negotiate far more purposefully and with a view to getting a new understanding on reciprocal market access.
I just on the China fact as well. I want to take that forward to Garima. Garima, as we touched on the transatlantic relations, the first aspect. One of the things that we kind of seen, as we touched on, was in the last 2 decades. We've kind of seen started with a pivot to Asia, and then while cabinet positions, as we touched on, are still being speculated. One of the things that's come out from the inside from the Trump's camp is they do see, and I quote, the significant and substantial downsize of America's security role, but with the European theater. And given how we saw the Indo-Pacific has taken precedence, because in 2017 was sort of Beijing's belligerence in the South China Sea, you've kind of seen that the Trump administration prioritized a lot of concrete steps in defense, the creation of the Tri-Service Exercise, Tiger Triumph, and defense operability, as well as STA under commerce. So is it fair to, what can you look forward into 2025? Do you see more military drills, more Quad with a security element? What would the Overton window look like right now for the Trump administration within that region?
I mean, it's hard to already talk of specific policies, but as a general approach to the Indo-Pacific, as you mentioned, I mean, the isolationism of foreign policy didn't quite materialize in the region. On the contrary, Trump won, we saw the revival of the Quad, the approach to competition with China, working closely with India and other partners. And if reports are right, and it's Mike Waltz's NSA, I mean, we would see obviously a continuation of a hawkish approach to China, but also sort of the idea of restoring stability in Europe and the Middle East so that the US can focus specifically on China. I think for a concern is, I mean, Biden administration has taken all of these points working with China and sort of refined them to an extent. For example, we've seen them craft a network of allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific working very closely. The Quad, I mean, you look at the immense progress made on the Quad, the working groups, the Sherpa structure, just the diplomatic and bureaucratic investment of the 4 countries. I think continuity on this would be good, but an issue with Mr. Trump is how do you work with allies if you consider them a burden, right? Like if you use a more muscular foreign policy approach, would it be useful in sort of reaching consensus on a lot of delicate topics when it comes to China? Already we are seeing news reports of countries in the region, but even Europe thinking of ways of cooperating with China in case Mr. Trump wants to, go alone or not really work together with the other partners. I think so that question would be key to see the policy of the administration going forward.
And just thinking about that Vivek, during Trump 1.1, there was this collaboration on, the security front, but on the economic front and the trade front, particularly vis-a-vis India, tensions, I wouldn't say came to a crescendo, but there were obviously with any relationship, a lot of tensions, particularly on the trade front. President Trump did call India tariff king, went on to increase import duty, particularly on steel and aluminum tariffs between, I think 10 to 25%. And this, of course, affected bilateral trade. US-India trade is hovering around 200 billion. There's a talk of trying to make it 500 billion, but there's also a worry of that coming back because under President Trump, also GSP, the Generalized System of Preferences, was reneged. So that obviously stalled trade. But of course, under the Biden administration, when you had the restart of the trade policy forum, some of these issues could get discussed. But I suppose my larger question is, in a time when we're talking about Make in India and the production-linked incentives, PLI schemes, how does a Make America Great Again, which is got a lot of emphasis on making America the manufacturing powerhouse that it once was, do you see those two forces clashing at some point? Is it sort of revisiting what we saw between 2017 to 2021?
Yeah, there is a lack of a complete consonance between US and India in terms of structural, sectors. If you look at, for example, the agriculture issue with the United States has been persisting for a long time, the subsidies. So structural issues aside, it is the problem on the trade bit has transcended multiple administrations in the US. So Biden administration was equally allergic to taking the trade negotiations to another level, and we saw a considerable degree of reluctance there from the Biden administration. Now in the next transition, when Trump administration comes, I don't see this really working out for both countries. I think as was laid out earlier, it's going to be a tough negotiation, and my sense is that instead of a blanket tariff, which Trump has talked about on various issues, it is more likely that he's going to take a sectoral approach. So, for example, he's going to pick up certain sectors and probably try the hard negotiations with India on those. And it depends on some of the negotiations that India can do there. On the supply side chain, I think some of the spin-offs of a high tariff on China will also depend on the capability of India to absorb those capacities at this point in time. And it's also the sectors. So, for example, the United States itself is, going high on semiconductors, etc. In that sense, the PLI scheme, which are the companies that are involved, will also be affected in the sense that Trump will pressure the American companies and investors to come back home. We'll see how that pans out.
Professor Mohan, as you said, Singapore and spent some time in the ASEAN region. One of the salient aspects of the Quad and the Indo-Pacific framework and that we've seen is about just strengthening the relationship with ASEAN countries. The Biden administration sort of adopted a small yard, high fence approach to China, particularly on national security issues which involved procurement of chips and other sensitive equipment that would help modernize China's military. But under Trump 1.0, we saw some of the things come to a crescendo on the trade front, Beijing and Washington getting sparring on trade in 2018. And this kind of led to, and Trump administration has sort of indicated higher tariffs on imports in China, and which will touch on 60%. What sort of ripple effects are you worried about for global trade, particularly for smaller countries, say like Singapore, which are open entrepôts that depend both on the United States and China for, the commercial relationship?
Look, I think there has been, as we said, there's continuity on the trade issue, broad continuity on the trade issue. There's been broad continuity in terms of the kind of technology denial that the US has erected under Trump, then made more systematic under Biden. So that is a continuing process. On the question of the how ASEAN is relating to this, here is the issue. In fact, ASEAN, as of now, has been a beneficiary because what you've seen is a trade diversification of Chinese exports, not directly to the US, but much of it's coming through ASEAN. So that means ASEAN now has more imports from China. It also has more exports to the United States. Now, but this is something I suspect Trump administration will want to crack down. That if Chinese solar panels are going to come to the US via ASEAN, US is going to crack down. So that is something for now ASEAN has benefited, but my sense is Trump will try and plug that loophole where China simply moves its production into ASEAN and continues to export. And I think the root cause is really China is in the middle of what is being called a second China shock, which is really a capacity to export or capacity in production, and China is determined to export more. And China doesn't import too much from the rest of the world. And I think that is the source of the problem. And I think if Trump is likely to go at it far more vigorously, and the ASEAN will have to adapt to that. And many others, some in India were dreaming that you could do the same as ASEAN, get Chinese investment to India, produce and export to the US. I don't think that loophole will last for too long.
Professor Mohan, I just want to stay on the ASEAN topic for a second, and Garima, I want to take it to you next. I mean, ASEAN centrality, has been tested in the past few years. In the sense that there's always a talk about ASEAN unity. However, you've seen, like, say, countries like Vietnam and Philippines have had direct umbrage with China and the South China Sea, given, the China sort of naval belligerence and sort of like, the Spratlys and the Paraceles Island. As I asked earlier of Singapore, which is sort of walking a tightrope between US and China, but some of the lesser affluent ASEAN countries like Myanmar, like Laos, like Cambodia, depend heavily on Chinese investments and, rightly so for their economy. But, as Beijing sort of testing ASEAN centrality, one of President Obama's pivot to Asia was sort of Washington being a signatory to the then Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was sort of seen as countering Beijing's influence in the region. And the first Trump administration pulled out on it and completely backed away from it. And some would say a possible Hillary Clinton administration would have done the same. But where would you fall on the TPP then? Would you say that the critics who say that pulling out of the TPP was sort of like scoring an own goal and allowing Beijing to consolidate its presence? And do you see like the IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework under Trump administration, able to sort of fulfill some of those roles that the TPP would have, especially on Pillar 3 and trade?
I mean, I think the days of TPP are long gone, not just with Trump, but also Biden administration and all countries sort of looking at reshoring and dealing bilaterally with competition with China. I think on the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, it can go either of two ways. Like either it can go really extreme, as we all just talked about, the policy of trade wars and tariffs, and with Lighthizer favoring an economic and technological decoupling from China to the extent that it would create problems for all of the partners and allies that the US has in the Indo-Pacific. I think that sort of policy would be really extreme. And then all the countries would sort of have to make a choice in the region, not just ASEAN. I mean, there we've also seen, for example, Indonesia. You didn't mention in the list of countries where it's also, I mean, pragmatic about ties with China, but potentially want to be closer to the United States. So I think it would be sort of a dilemma for the countries in the region if you have these really extreme policies, like which way do you go and which way do you choose. But as we've mentioned, all three of us on the panel, I think this is the sort of future of any sort of economic framework cooperation. It's very much going to be dictated by the US and its terms, and rather than sort of listening to what the partners in the region want.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. And I think, Indonesia, of course, an important country, and then Prabowo just had a call with President Trump. And just sorry, and before I do that, as people who are joining in the webinar, apologies if you joined a little late because we have tech difficulties in the beginning. Please feel free to set in your question through the chat box, and we'll try and get to as many as we can for our speakers. So I want to take that next question to you, Vivek. The next year, 2025, India is going to host a Quad Leader Summit. It was supposed to do so here in before. But of course, elections in May in India, in April to June rather, and the November elections in the US precluded either President Biden or Prime Minister Modi, making those commitments immediately. But 2025 is on the agenda, and the Wilmington Declaration, the Quad Summit in Delaware, was seen as a success, built on Prime Minister Modi's very successful state visit 2023. Um, what sort of emphasis do you see President Trump rather giving, the Quad at a leaders level summit? Because President Biden, of course, elevated some of those discussions. How much further can President Trump take it, particularly on issues such as critical emerging technology that involves, as we touched on, technology transfer and sharing of information? Because the US and India have a very unusual relationship, a very strong strategic partnership, but not traditional allies. This form of defense sharing has sort of been unprecedented for the US with non-treaty allies. And of course, Japan and Australia are treaty allies and have trade agreements as well with the US. So I'm just curious, how do you see President Trump approaching this aspect? Also, furthermore, how does he look at the Quad vis-a-vis the Squad, the grouping with the Philippines, and AUKUS, more of a security-ish element in the Indo-Pacific?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, the question about whether India needs another strategic upgrade with the United States to get the technologies that it still can't. For example, the EMALS technology that has been there on the aircraft carrier, that has been there. But I don't think Trump administration per se will talk about, or it could, because of the unpredictability associated with the association is a big question. But if you look at the people, Mike Waltz, for instance, has talked about India-US upgrade. It also depends on what India will do, and I don't think it will move towards an alliance. But some of these agreements, for example, the major defense partner status has already allowed India to circumvent some of the necessities in transfer of technologies. The conduits there, but on your question about whether where is going to be Trump's focus, I think on the minilateral itself, it's going to be a strong focus. I think if the last administration was any template, then I think the Quad will be a focus for Trump administration. But it comes with a caveat, which is I think it'll be affected by the bilaterals that happen with Washington on all the four fronts of the Quad nations. So, for example, if the Japan and India, etc., they could have some ripple effects inside underlying the Quad. But I think as minilateral itself, it's going to stay where it is, and I think it's going to further solidify in the region in the Indo-Pacific. On your question of AUKUS and Squad, I don't think the Squad debate sits very well in the United States. I think for various reasons, because the United States wants to, and particularly the Trump administration is likely to take it bilaterally. They don't want to enhance or increase the periphery of the Quad just as yet. And also, I think structurally in the region, it'll be beneficial, or it'll be apt for the United States to focus and keep the Pacific theater, the priorities there, and the Indo theater in two separate ways. I think there will be linkages, of course, as we are in terms of strategy, but in terms of specifics of expanding the grouping itself, it'll be much more difficult.
Yeah. No, I wanted to speak about that grouping a little further, and Professor Mohan, given your your current based out of Delhi, I wanted to first ask you right now a couple of things. One is, Washington says it sees India, that want to see an India that takes an aggressively more leadership position, in the region. And obviously the rivalry with China has been central to various U.S. goals, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. Some would say perhaps it may not have galvanized to this kind of priority had it not been for China under Xi in the same way. But we've seen after the Galvan Valley clashes, New Delhi's been perhaps a little more assertive on the Quad, the I2U2, while not security pacts, but they have components of a containment strategy, some would say. Given the recent détente that we've seen at the border between China and India, and after the last few years of tensions, how do you see New Delhi's approach to Beijing should there be a current flashpoint under Trump 2.0 in Indo-Pacific?
Look, I just wanted to add a word about the Quad meeting in Delhi. I think the real issue is, US president is like Lord Jagannath, right? I mean, doesn't come out of the temple very often. Now, the US presidents don't like traveling. You have a 78-year-old man getting him out of Washington to come to Asia. And if he comes all the way to India, he would want to go somewhere else. So I think the problem is not with the Quad. I think the problem is to, make him to see the value of coming over to India, which actually means what is it that India will give? Or this is not going to be framed by the diplomats of the two sides. The question is, he has to see some concrete gains in the relationship, whether it is on trade, more defense deals, and a greater, as you said, a greater Indian commitment to play a larger role in its region. So I think it is going to be a separate negotiation. For India, I think this is a big opportunity. It can we use the Quad to get him over to India quite early on in the term, and use the occasion to really give it a big push to the relationship on a wide basis, because it will be less about the Quad than about the India US bilateral relationship. And then if he comes here, of course, there are other things that can be done in relation to the Quad. Second, I would say the key for Trump, as I said, look, is market access. So we have to, work out something there to propitiate the president, and I think that has to be to the benefit of India as well. So this is where I think some creative trade diplomacy on the Indian side would be very important. The second aspect is the question of burden sharing. I think unlike the European allies, India is in a different league, that it is willing to do more in the region, unlike where the US allies in Europe don't want to spend on defense, they don't want to take more responsibility. So India as a rising power is quite happy to take more responsibility. And that's where the US needs to support India with the right technology transfer or weapons transfer. So the deal on burden sharing, where India takes a larger responsibility, is possible if that can be negotiated, which again fits in with the ideological agenda of Trump, that the allies need to do more of Trump, that the ally is prepared to do more. The question is, what are the things we can do and how that can be done? Third, on the China thing, I think it's easy to overestimate what's happened. There's only a disengagement that is completed. This is good, but this is not a dramatic breakthrough in the relationship. We are a long way from restoring normalcy on the relationship. So I don't see any major change in the triangular dynamic between India, China, and the US. China's relationship with the US are not in a great shape. China's relationship with India are not in a great shape. But both Mr. Modi and Trump are quite happy to engage with Mr. Xi. So I don't think anybody's objecting to it, that India talking to China or US talking to China. But I think the structural contradictions are so deep. So that will remain a fairly strong bonding between Delhi and Washington.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Professor Mohan. And again, when we speak about flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific, Garima, I wanted to get your perspective as you move a little more eastward. Another flashpoint in the South China Sea and around that region of East China Sea, rather, in the Taiwan Strait. And there are a lot of these analogies that have been compared between Taiwan and Ukraine. The war in Ukraine began in 2022. Given both Taiwan's size and vulnerability against sort of a larger aggressor, apart from security concerns, we're talking about a lot of supply chain vulnerability in a post-pandemic recovery, and Taiwan obviously epitomizes semiconductor manufacturing with some of the largest, chips manufacturing over there. And this is a concern for Washington as well. And we saw how even under the Biden administration, the priorities was Chips and Sciences Act, where the Department of Commerce operated with a very Pentagon-like national security lens. What sort of concerns do you now foresee going forward to that region right now? And with the Trump administration, given right now with, say, someone like Representative Mike Waltz, who's seen more as very hawkish in China, would that be extra focused towards Taiwan and the security concerns of Taiwan over there?
Certainly. So on Taiwan, we've seen sort of mixed signals come from the Trump camp. Mr. Trump himself said that Taiwan should pay the US for its defense, whereas a lot of China hawks advising him see this as a central flashpoint in the Indo-Pacific, the central conflict that needs to be dealt with, and would put pressure on allies to sort of come up with contingency plans and their part in the scenario. So I think there are definitely two different directions that we see being taken here, and a general interest to sort of withdraw from conflicts in Europe and the Middle East and really focus on the Indo-Pacific. So that's one point. On semiconductors, of course, the Biden administration was a partner, for example, in India's semiconductor mission. And there was a lot of talk of US companies investing in India, not just on semiconductors, but also more broadly electronics, etc., for India to play a larger role in tech supply chains as countries seek to diversify and de-risk from China. But again, like the central contradiction is that what do you do with a president that's more protectionist, that's talking about bringing manufacturing back to the US, bringing sort of investments back to the US, and not so much looking at the sort of broader picture of what can allies in the region do? For example, I mean, this was very clear under the Biden administration, particularly also with Europe, for example, pressure on the Netherlands, ASML, and other companies, and sort of guiding them to work with preferred partners in the region. But really, I think this is up for grabs, and it sort of links back to the conversation we've had of the Quad and with the partners and allies in the region. What will be your approach? Will your approach be sort of we work together collectively to deal with the China challenge, where each partner plays an important role, be it on in terms of supply chains or in terms of military capabilities, etc., or are we talking about this sort of rather inward-looking, bring jobs and manufacturing back to the US, and then everybody deals with China on their own? So I think there is a central contradiction in this. We saw this in Trump 1 with the revival of the Quad, but at the same time talking about tariffs and putting pressure on allies. And it would be interesting to see how this unfolds during this current administration.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of administration, Vivek, I want to take that to you right now, because obviously, the airwaves, are full of speculations, and some names are more concrete. You've seen Elise Stefanik for the U.S. ambassador for UN role, names like Senator Marco Rubio for Secretary of State, Mike Waltz, NSA, and of course, I think Senator Bill Hagerty's name has been tossed around. I mean, Senator Bill Hagerty had served as ambassador to Japan, Mike Waltz, co-chair of the India caucus. So this Asia experience coming in, given these are sort of President Trump's inner circle and still early days, but if you were to look ahead and try and paint a 2025 picture, because Trump 1.0 seemed a little people coming in, people coming out. He picked his first Secretary of State was someone from the private sector. That's not happened so much now, at least, but there's definitely very heavy, would you say, security lens given to sort of the names that are being tossed around. How would you kind of look at what's the names that are being spoken about and speculated over?
Yeah, I think first it's important to see the distinction between the last administration and this. And one of that is that Trump has often said in his campaign that last time he was pushed to a corner to take decisions to hire some people that he did not want. There were institutional pressures, there was financial pressures, there were funders. I don't think that stands true anymore, because he's taken his poise to take his own people, who he believes will deliver on his promises. So I think that's a clear distinction. But coming specifically to people, I think Lee Zeldin is poised to take the EPA, and if you look at the views there, it's pretty stark in the sense that Trump has also promised to take out the EPA out of Washington, base it somewhere in Colorado. If that happens, we'll see how that pans out. But I think his views on reversing some of the Biden administration's steps on energy, for example, fracking and drilling is going to be at the helm in terms of those reversals. But he's also, I think, the world should brace up for some slew of executive orders on the first day or first week, where he's going to reverse quite a few policies. We'll have to see specifically those that Biden reversed, some of the Trump's decision that Biden reversed. Among them is, of course, the Muslim nation ban and a few others. So in terms of other personalities, I think who stands out is Stefanik. Stefanik's views on Israel, everybody's out there. I mean, she's called for the gutting of United Nations Agency for Palestinian refugees. and she's a vocal supporter of Israel. She was at the helm dealing with the campus protests and taking the presidents of the universities here head on. So I think those really stand out. In terms of Secretary of State, Rubio and Walz, I think their views are also out in the open. Walz was head of the India Caucus. He's also proponent of a India-US defense cooperation bill. So I think that the relationship and Marco Rubio he's one of the few who's been sanctioned by China. If you look in the past, so I think if you put these together, it's really not looking good for US-China relationship, in the sense that you have a bullish president and his team will push back against China hard. But for India, I think the story is just the opposite. I think it's I wouldn't say rosy, but I think it's an optimistic sort of team that can work with India.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to kind of, because obviously people are speculating on, Senator Representative Walz, Senator Rubio being more pro-India and China hawks. And of course, we understand that it doesn't work on binaries, given, U.S. Foreign policy for the region is going to be far more comprehensive than just individuals. Professor Mohan, when we look at a comparison between the Wilmington Declaration that came out this year and I think the Hiroshima Declaration that came out in May 2023, there's sort of a contrast in language. That the Wilmington Declaration was seen as a little more blunter. It specifically mentions, and I quote, the militarization of disputed features and the coercive and intimidating maneuvers in the South China Sea. So, given that the Quad is always stated it's not against one actor, it's sort of an economic convergence and for various initiatives. But do you see that as the tempestuous region that it is, President Trump, of course, accelerating military drills vis-a-vis more Malabar exercises and something far more direct that perhaps Beijing could see as confrontational?
No, I don't think you should read these statements too literally. I mean, if you see Quad was revived in 2017, and if you look at last 7 years, India has been far more forthcoming on the security issues in East Asia rather than it was in the beginning. So I think that's been a general trend. But I think from there to jump to see, look, what exactly will happen between US and China would be risky at this point. So I don't think we should focus on that micro level. But I think at this point, really, from what he has said so far, and the team that he has assembled, as Vivek pointed out, it is going to be a confrontational approach to China. But as we know, Trump is a deal maker. The setting up of a confrontation could also be one to make deals. So in which he wanted, last administration wanted a trade deal badly. So I think you got to take this, the bureaucratic, got to take this drafting, position shifting, that's all one part. But the big game by the principal, the chief of the US, is to, leverage a whole lot of things to get advantage. But what actually happens on the ground at that point of time depends on a lot of things, a lot of actions. China could do things which will provoke the US. Like Biden came to the, White House hoping that Russia can be kept quiet. He had a summit meeting with Putin in June 2021, but with Ukraine invasion, everything went off the rails. So I think we shouldn't just keep seeing that every micro event we can speculate at this point of time. The direction is clear. It is one of unilateralism, of wanting to assert American position, and the fact that the US is doing much better economically than China today, than Europe, gives it a huge advantage. And Trump his whole style of approach, unlike Biden, gives him a lot of advantages. So if you want to call it the madman theory or whatever it is, that he has an advantage. So he's going to push through. So I don't think we should worry about every minor aspect. The broad direction is clear. And I think for India, it's an opportunity to now take the relationship to a higher level with expanding role in the whole of Indo-Pacific region.
Yeah, no, and just wanted to get very much your perspective on the same as well. In terms of just in the Indo-Pacific, one of the things that, we touched on the Squad and AUKUS. For a lot of people, when the Squad came out, there was a little uncertainty because it kind of was the Quad partners with Philippines and not India. and of course, AUKUS we've seen a little more militarized. But would you kind of see the Squad and the Quad sort of bifurcating between the two elements of the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean, the Pacific, whereas it's sort of seen as India's realm is the Indian Ocean and the Squad is sort of more for Pacific partners. Is that how would you kind of bifurcate the roles between the Quad and the Squad in this?
I mean, the Quad's remit is quite broad. It's certainly not limited to the Indian Ocean. It also covers certain aspects, for example, Pacific Islands, etc. And so I think the idea is there are an emerging number of minilaterals in the Indo-Pacific. This is a new reality. The region is institutionally very thin, and so we see the emergence of minilaterals. So Quad, Squad, AUKUS is one of them. And I think this networked security architecture has a configuration of different partners. For example, India has a number of trilaterals. France, India, Australia, Japan. And we see this emerging in proliferation. I don't think this is a sort of burden sharing or division effort. The Quad covers everything. And in fact, even if the Quad doesn't specifically talk of security, the issues that it covers have security implications. For example, critical emerging technologies, maritime domain awareness, which can seem quite harmless, but also keeps an eye on tracking activities in the region. And of course, the leaders when they meet and the foreign ministers when they meet, of course, there is a coordination on positions on sort of global issues. So security is sort of built in. We do not need to see a specific Quad exercise. But I think that all of these platforms serve a different purpose. AUKUS serves a different purpose. Squad is different. And I certainly don't think this is a sort of regional burden sharing effort.
No, absolutely. And I want to take that to Vivek as well, because when AUKUS came about, there was obviously tensions with France on the purchase of submarines as well. And in some ways, is it seeing that it allowed UK to get more involved with the Indo-Pacific, a country that's not in the region at all? How do you see progress right now under AUKUS, and where do you see the Trump administration is trying to take it? As we touched on, and all the panelists sort of in consensus that there's going to be more of a hawkish and a security element that's going to come through with the Trump 2.0. Would you see now the AUKUS getting more preeminence, as we touched on some of the tensions with Taiwan, particularly in that part?
I don't see Trump sidelining AUKUS and the focus there. I see AUKUS taking its own course, but I think there's only that much that you can do with AUKUS. It's a long-term in terms of providing momentum to it. It's a long-term project. You will only see coming AUKUS completely into fruition. Let's say a decade and a half, even 2 decades down the line. So I don't see any immediate steps in terms of what Trump can do to really speed up the AUKUS process, but certainly the conversations therein, the nuts and the bolts of the pillars of the cooperation can be sort of refined in terms of the Trump administration's approach. He could ask the rest of the other two partners to do more in terms of Australia, and they're already doing in terms of if you see the Northern Australian belt, the United States is going back to the World War II bases and reviving them. So there is a definitive strategy in terms of how US is looking at those, and I think eventually a decade down the line, the structural part of it, the strategic piece of it, I think it's going to come together.
Thank you. No, this has been a riveting discussion. We're just 5 minutes out, and I normally wanted to give it time back to each of you, starting with you, Professor Mohan, for any closing thoughts, because one is obviously the election last week. We're still catching up right from that results, and I know it's very hard to read the tea leaves, especially on a Trump administration and crystal ball gazing. But from all your years of sagacity and understanding the region and seeing successive U.S. administrations and being in Washington, what would be your Cliff Notes assessment for policymakers in Delhi looking ahead?
I think my reading. I think, as I said in the beginning, we got to understand what is driving change in Washington. That there are fundamental changes in the U.S. thinking on global economic order, on alliances, on technological regulation. So these are big changes that are taking place in the US. And I think, as I said, how each of these relationships plays out will be a subset of the larger change that is taking place in the US. I would say in all the three fronts, a US that is trying to de-risk from China on the economic front would find India a useful partner, as it has. And in India that is more open to US economic engagement on the market access side, it can reap enormous benefits. On the alliances and burden, India is not an ally, but in India that is willing to play a larger role in Asia and the Indo-Pacific, we'll find even greater complementarity. And the trick is again negotiating what are the terms on which, as you mentioned in your previous intervention. So I don't think this Quad is opposed to India or Quad. So there is an issue in the Philippine Sea. So you're bringing people together in the region to deal with the question of what's happening in the on the Philippines, between Philippines and China. Then bringing the allies of Japan and South Korea, who don't get along with each other all these years. So putting them together in a trilateral arrangement actually adds to the pressure on China. Then you have AUKUS, where the US is strengthening the deterrence through nuclear submarines in the region. And within the Quad, India is the largest country in Asia, which is the natural balancer against China. So it has a value of its own. So I think each one has a different function. So I think 20 years of transformation of India-US relationship has put us in a good place. Now the challenge for Delhi is how does it manage the specifics of a Trump administration, its worldview, what is it looking for from its partners, and whether we can provide some satisfaction to the US on that score and get something from us. So I think the key is a lot of people in India don't like the word transactional, but transactional is good. You give something, you get something. It's a straightforward deal rather than this lovey-dovey stuff. Even we know in love and war, there's nothing is ever purely for intellectual reasons. So I think it's a good moment. I think in India that's open to bargaining, in India that's open to give and take, we'll find the Trump administration quite a valuable partner that can boost India's position in the region and the world.
No, absolutely. When you hear deal, so I'm hearing a lot of art of the deal, which is sort of what's going to happen right now, or art of the trade deals, or that we're going to see in Trump 2.0. Garima, I want to get to you for your closing thoughts as well. But given that you're in Europe, just wanted to ask you, and maybe you can pivot this in with your closing statement. What is sort of your key European partners' outlook on the Indo-Pacific right now? France, Germany, that have been very engaged with the global state of world affairs right now, and of course, a leadership change in the UK. Government has come in after a decade plus. So what's that outlook right now on the Indo-Pacific?
I mean, after the first Trump administration, Europe quickly turned towards the Indo-Pacific, discovered Indo-Pacific strategies, realized the need to work with partners. And I think as tensions between a Trump administration and European leaders persist, this trend would accelerate. And I do see that working well in India's favor, as a lot of these European countries look for partners in the Indo-Pacific, and countries, for example, like India, that can play a role helping them de-risk and, looking at supply chains, European companies investing. We've had the visit of the German Chancellor with his entire cabinet, and German companies visiting India. We've seen similar trends from, everyone from Spain to Sweden. Of course, France is a very important partner. The EU Commission, that is the hearings are happening right now in Brussels of the new commissioners, and India is mentioned in the political guidelines and mentioned by almost every single commissioner in the hearing. So I think this sort of trend of understanding that the transatlantic alliance, while important, does not respond to the urgent needs and crises in the world today, particularly Europe's relationship with China, Russia-China alignment, which is sort of pushing it towards the Indo-Pacific more and looking for partners in the region. I think we will see this trend accelerate. So in a way, good news for partners in the Indo-Pacific, specifically India.
No, absolutely. Vivek, final thoughts?
No, I think if you talk to people past in the past on the Hill, they would have often said what does India have to offer, and the only answer you got then was trust. I think that's changed. There is significant stepping up in the Indo-Pacific. You see India becoming a part of the CMF. For a long time, we resisted that because of Pakistan Navy or otherwise. Also, the interests were far from our coasts. So I think that the Western Indian Ocean is now a considerable part of our strategic framework in the Indo-Pacific. Plus, in terms of IFC IOR, we provide not just the United States, but around 15 or 30 liaison officers a real-time information in the Indo-Pacific and the Indian Ocean. I think so. In terms of giving back to the United States and other countries in the region, we have stepped up. Now, the question for the Trump administration is what more can it ask India? And then where does India draw the line? For example, in Afghanistan, it was putting the boots on the ground. What's it going to be next time?
Yeah, well, thank you. And, obviously right now, as we get into 2025 and the elections are behind us, but not to look forward to, especially as the new Trump administration comes back. So is it going to be more of the same or a lot more different? Like what does it mean for security trade? What does it mean for the U.S.-China relationship? What does it mean for the U.S.-India relationship and the larger Indo-Pacific? Thank you. This has been a riveting conversation. Professor Siraja Mohan, Garima Mohan, Vivek, thank you so much. I am so delighted that you all made time on a very, very busy morning, afternoon, and evening. 3 different time zones from 3 different parts of the world, very important regions. Thank you. And this conversation will be available later on for people who couldn't join in. And thank you all so much for this. So I've enjoyed this conversation. Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.